Well, so it's we're in conversation, Shyam. Is that right? What's your thought on the title and of this conference? There's a reference to small island states not being guilty of being the cause, but of course being picture postcards or poster childs of those that will suffer from global warming. Is that it's my experience with the Maldives is we're always the and small island states. We're always the poster child of global warming, and people say, "Poor you, you know, you're going to be underwater, etc." And I just think that that's a bit of a fallacy for various reasons. So, firstly, I think India, your country, and China have much more to suffer because global warming will impact 90% of the GDP of the poor. So when you think about a country like India, there are sort of 500 million to 600 million people who are either farmers. There are about 200 million farmers and another 300 million people that are dependent on them. So global warming is going to affect 90% of their GDP. So it might not affect the GDP of the affluent countries in general, but for a country like India, that size of population is going to be, the impact it will have is so much more considerable than the population of all the small island states. And the other thing on the picture postcards thing is the Maldives and small island states, we've always been sinking. That's how we came about. You had these geological activities, these bumps, these big mountains came through the sea, like you see with Bora Bora and the Seychelles, and then like a bump on the head, they started to recede. And because the temperature was between 20 and 30 degrees, coral started to grow and fill up the lagoons. So in theory, if we keep our coral alive, we'll continue to survive as sea levels rise slowly. But other low-lying countries, Holland, many parts of India, Bangladesh, Wall Street as an example, don't have that benefit. They're going to have to continuously build bigger and bigger barriers to the point that life becomes unattractive. So I think that's we're always given. It's always a myth. I don't know what you feel about that and how important an issue it is to India, because I think India has much more to lose from global warming when you think about the number of people you have. Hello? We're having problems with mics. There we go. Good.
Thank you very much, Sonu, for setting the stage for this conversation. Let me begin by saying that, whatever may be the notion of climate justice, I think it would be fair to say that there are no winners or losers in this game. All of us are impacted. So it's not as if, there has been this notion that some category of countries may, suffer less. Some categories of countries may be hurt much more. But that is looking at this particular challenge from a very narrow time frame. Because I think what has become very clear is that this is a very fragile planet. Yeah. And it is linked together with also very, very fragile, living systems, all interdependent. Yeah. So it is very short-sighted for any country, whether it's an island country like the Maldives, or it is a country like India, or a country like Iceland, or Europe, or the United States, to think that this is somebody else's problem. And therefore, our responsibility, we can, in fact, evade some of the responsibility. That, I think, is a very short-sighted view. Because unless we actually come, face to face with the fact that we are actually living on a planet, a very, very rare planet, which has this wonderful life, which has evolved over hundreds of years, the kind of colors which you see, the kind of, the biodiversity that is all around you, that all this is held together across the world, by very, very fragile threads. And it's like a piece of cloth. It has the warp and the weft. You remove one strand, and the entire piece of cloth starts coming apart.
Yeah.
That's the kind of challenge that we are facing. So I think, yes, climate justice is something that we must be paying attention to, but what really you need is for the world to get together to deal with this, which is not happening. So even in terms of, where we are today, I think there are very encouraging things happening. Ambassador here has spoken about, the importance of the reference to the ICJ, kind of things that you're doing here, in terms of environmental sustainability. All these are important and all these need to be scaled up. But I think we would not be honest if we do not, in fact, accept what the UN Secretary General has said, that we are really hurtling down towards climate disaster and we have not taken off our foot from the accelerator.
Yeah.
So that is the nature of the challenge which we are facing, and let us not, it's all very good to talk about, having an optimistic outlook. We are in a very, very dangerous place. Thank you.
Before you continue, I just want to sort of just comment on what you said, Shyam. So I heard two things. One was you touched briefly on this idea that it's not just global warming. There are other planetary boundaries. And I think we mustn't forget this idea of the Stockholm Resilience Center of these 10 planetary boundaries, which we've exceeded 4 of them, because we might solve global warming. We solved ozone depletion. In the 70s, we had an issue where the ozone layer was going to threaten our existence, and we fixed that by eliminating CFCs, deforestation, extinction of species. Those are areas where we've broken boundaries. So, and it's all connected. So I think that's very important. I was a bit surprised to hear that you feel that the world's not getting together, because you're India's representative of COP, which is the main get-together of the world. So that's a bit depressing to hear that. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Perhaps over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello. Hello again. Well, thank you both for setting the stage. But I must begin by thanking you as our host, general host, for inviting me here. It allows me to combine 2 of my 4 passions in life, music through Usha, as we heard, and literature, so we've heard from all the others as well. Well, I had resolved, when I accepted this invitation, not to speak about the past. I want to confine myself to the future. I'm very unhappy about the past. Both of you have expressed this, but you did mention 3 achievements from the past, which I want to build on. 4 or 5 months ago, I became acquainted with what we heard. I became involved in an effort to bring to international courts a fundamental question, not justice or adoption, but the legal obligation of states to reduce climate change. A legal obligation. We have not confronted that. You mentioned the work that has been done in these various fora, including when you were the representative of India. In my profession, international law profession, we have failed. We have failed in this issue. So this is why I'm all of a sudden, and I've been very depressed about that, I must admit. Aside from other even more important questions like war and peace, I've been very depressed about how unsuccessful we have. And in recent times, I've been trying to understand why we have not been successful. And I've just basically come to the conclusion, the way we deal with these things in this COP system with all the representative states is not conducive to achieving agreement on things of this nature, because we all end up with compromising and so forth. This is why when we were preparing the blurb about this session, I asked that the reference to COP 28 or whatever, 27 follow-up and so forth, be eliminated. I wanted to look to something different, and that is the possibility that within a very short time, 6 months or so, we will get opinions from the International Court of Justice, from the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and from the South American, Latin American human rights courts, precisely on this question, as I mentioned before. Is there a legal obligation on states to reduce, prevent climate change? This, to me, is a game changer.
So this is a really interesting angle. I'm sort of generally an optimist, and I feel that we will make some great breakthroughs on this issue of global warming for various reasons, and I'll touch upon them in a moment. But do you feel? I mean, it's very likely that the legal opinions will rule in favour because so many people suffer from global warming. So if you're a justice, the idea is to prevent harm to the maximum amount of people. That's what I believe you learn in law school. So the opinion is mostly going to be in favour. So what happens when that happens, where the legal opinions of courts, high courts, say that it is the obligation of states to...
So that's why I'm looking at Jenny, because she asked me these very questions when we were discussing this over dinner.
Yeah.
And what is the effect of these, as you mentioned, non-binding opinions of these three very important courts? No, it will not be implemented directly by states for the reasons I just mentioned, because they will find a way in these negotiations not to implement them, but rather courts, national courts, which states have to abide by, they will be able to use these opinions to say, instead of what they've been hearing from the advocates until now, there's no legally binding, etc., they will be able to turn to these opinions, these are highly authoritative courts, to say there is an obligation. I can now build on that to make a binding decision in my country against my government.
Right. So that you feel that's going to be give an opportunity for policymakers who want to make those decisions, but they're unpopular decisions. That's the issue, is it? Right. So that's the issue. Okay. And do you think that's going to be a game changer? What do you think about that, Shyam?
At the risk of violating the approach that my friend has put forward, let us not look to the past. So on the question of the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, that it will oblige countries to really look at possible legal instruments. My point is, we already had a climate change treaty, which was concluded in 1992. There were obligations, legal obligations, which are set out in great detail in that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So why do we have now a situation where we have to reinvent the wheel? As if we do not have any legal, obligation. Legal obligations are right there. What has happened is that there are countries which have eviscerated this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Right.
So we are now in this situation. Okay, if making the reference to the International Court of Justice, we are able to get a favorable opinion, which is a question mark, despite the optimism you have. Because from now, there will be written submissions made by member states of the United Nations as to what is the solution to this or what is the legal position. Then after that, there will be oral submissions. There will be public hearings before the court.
Right.
Which is going to take quite some time. And will we come up with a very clear-cut, advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice? It all depends on what are the nature of the submissions.
Yeah.
Because the court cannot overrule, in a sense, what the opinion that comes out from those submissions. So, yes, let us be optimistic about this. Let us try and make certain that those advisory opinions, in fact, further push this process.
Yeah.
But I would not, hold my breath over this. Right. Having been through a very tortuous negotiating process myself, I'm not so optimistic, but I'm very happy to be proved wrong.
I just think that the ability to sue companies, governments for environmental, for destroying the environment, it would be another lever to push and influence behaviour. and I know there's quite a few private offices and funds that have been funding a case against Bolsonaro, the former Brazilian leader, for his actions in the rainforest and the destruction of the rainforest. I think all of those things are fantastic. It's a bit like you have the international criminal courts on war crimes. It doesn't stop people from committing war crimes, but it is a little bit of an influence. You hope that the moral thing, and I think that comes to a point I'd like to make. So if you could just bear with me a second whilst I explain this thought. So for me, in my experience, one of the things that, as an entrepreneur in the service industry, and especially in this sort of context where we are creating these islands where we're like the government in a way. We're generating our power, we're desalinating our water, we're treating our waste, and we also become the welfare state. So, for example, our hosts have a medical insurance, which we pay for, but there's only so much that medical insurance that a company can afford pays. And so if someone has a more serious illness, the government, there's no welfare states. The government aren't going to cover that, cancer or something more serious. We end up covering that. So to try and minimize that, we try and change people's behavior. Also, in the service industry, we believe strongly that people in the service industry, just like tennis players, need to practice. They need to do push-ups. Like tennis players do push-ups, people in the service industry need to practice as well. So we believe meditation is very important because the best service host is someone who's able to still his mind and practice radical listening and can listen to their guests with every single pore. And so trying to encourage our hosts to meditate, to do yoga, is very important for us from the point of view of reducing our medical costs and also driving them to be better performers. It's a bit like you're a football team and you want to get your team to go to the gym. So our gym for the service industry is that. And so we've been thinking about how do you make people change their behavior. And there was a study, if I can just borrow a flip chart a sec. So just because I want to just ask you a question about this in a second. I'm sorry to be a little bit long-winded about this, but there was a research by behavioral psychologists who did various tests on children, trying to influence them to change their behavior. And what they found was, it's called the influencer model, and what they found is you have motivation here, and you have ability. And then you have personal. You then have social. And then you have structural. And what they found was that if you want to make long-lasting change of behavior, if you really want people to change the way they do things, you've got to tick at least 4 of these boxes. So this legal framework is obviously a structural motivation, the fact that you can be sued and you can go to jail. So that International Court of Justice, the COP talks, is that as well. Governments having policies. But then when you have personal motivation or social motivation, personal motivation could be, for example, feed-in tariffs. So feed-in tariffs here. And social motivation may be the social media. So if you look at, let's say, the UK and the US, we've had a huge reduction in plastic waste and the use of plastic. And when you look at Google hits, it's quite an interesting phenomenon. The top 5 countries in terms of pollution are all in South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, not China. And when you look at the Google hits on the subject, the topic of plastic in the oceans, there are very little Google hits. Whereas in the UK and the US, it's very topical. And that's why, in spite of the size of the American economy, there's very little plastic waste in relationship to others. So social motivation becomes important. And I think this issue about our climate is very important. And then you've got the ability. You've got things like the fact that renewables are now cheaper. Solar is cheaper in 90% of the planet. So I think that gives me great hope as well. So I think that I'm generally an optimist, and it may be too late. So the topic of this discussion is the time. We don't have time on our hands because we've woken up a bit late. But what's very clear in my mind is, from ticking one of those boxes back in the 80s, slowly we're ticking all of those. Wind, solar are dramatically cheaper. I mean, there are many countries where it's cheaper to introduce solar or wind than to actually operate a coal mine, as an example. So I think that's helping a lot, plus the social motivation, etc. And I think we need to hit all those angles. We can't just have COP talks, policymakers. I mean, that's great, of course, but then policymakers can't just create laws. They should also create motivations. In so many countries after COP, feed-in tariffs have been removed. If you look at the UK, it's a perfect example of where there was a budding, emerging renewable industry, and then the Conservatives with David Cameron pulled the feed-in tariffs. Another thing they did anyway. So I think one needs to add all those elements, and then of course threatening to sue people as well. That's fantastic. It's just another fantastic push to motivate a change of behavior, and I think we're moving towards that.
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. We were discussing earlier about what both of us observed in our, shall we say, lifetime. If we compare '92, when I was in the Stockholm conference, I can tell you some absolutely terrible stories about that. I don't think they would occur. That type of a story would happen today when people went out of their way to avoid any type of obligation. But we were discussing what happens on the ground, which isn't always reflected in policy. The examples you gave going around the country, perhaps you could share that with us, with the rest of us.
Yeah, so let me make something very clear. This is not to say that all these efforts, at whatever level they are being made, as I said, I mean, what you are doing here is a great example to be followed. There is a great deal happening at the grassroots level because actually my experience being not just a climate change negotiator, but being also associated with drawing up India's own climate change action plan. In that context, I went around the whole country at the grassroots level. And actually what is very inspiring is that there is a huge amount of innovation happening virtually in every nook and corner of India. Why? Because climate change is not something in the future. For those people, climate change is happening now.
Yeah.
They have had to adapt to climate change. They have to find ways in which they can survive. So I always say, when we are talking about emissions, for the West and the advanced countries, these are lifestyle emissions. For countries like India, they are actually survival emissions. There's a huge difference. Now, India, we are told coal is a big problem. You are not going off coal. Okay. What happens when Ukraine crisis takes place? All those people who are talking about, India must get away from coal, your addiction to coal is a threat to the world, what do? Immediately, Germany starts reopening its coal-based thermal power plants. Immediately, Japanese start reopening their coal-based thermal plants. Even the Chinese do. Why? Because no compromise with our lifestyle. So, if you are talking about motivation and change, I think at that level, that there is no free lunch in a sense. So while countries like India and countries like the Maldives must do whatever they can, but within the limitation of their resources. But, others who have greater capability, greater resources, need to do more. So that is why one of the most important principles in the climate change regime was common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Long-winded phrase, what does it mean? It means not that I have the right as India to spew as much carbon as I want into the atmosphere. No, that's a caricature of the position of developing countries. What we are saying is, in any case, we will do what we can, but within the limitation of our resources. So we have to make that energy transition. We know that in India we cannot continue to, in fact, maintain our growth with greater and greater dependence on fossil fuels. All these are imported. We are paying huge sums of money for this. So it makes great sense for India to make that transition from a pattern of economic development, which is essentially fossil fuel based, to a pattern of development which is more renewable energy based, more clean energy based. And that is what we are doing. If you look at the targets that we have put forward.
Can I follow up on this?
Sorry?
Please.
Yeah.
Just let me complete this argument. So that in any case we have to do. India cannot be another China. Not possible. That kind of pattern of growth is simply not replicable in a case like India. So we have to find another strategy of development. We are perhaps not always successful in doing that, but I think we are getting there. I think that's important. But what I wanted to point out was that the motivation that you're talking about, if I look at it on a global scale, the most important motivating factor and the driver of change is the sense of equity. I will do something that I consider to be fair and just. Now, that sense of justice does not currently underlie the climate change effort that we are making. So, all the things that you are saying, very worthwhile. Please, in fact, increase their scale. Whatever we do at any level is very, very valuable. And we need to be able to upscale them. But we cannot get away from the fact, two things. One, ultimately, it is states who have to take action. So even if there is an advisory opinion, to think that we can somehow, push the states aside and, carry on, I'm sorry, that doesn't happen. The states will have to implement whatever policies are agreed upon. And secondly, I think what is also very important is that in making this change, whatever we agree upon, and if the advisory opinion of the ICJ does not have that sense of equity and justice, I'm afraid it will not work.
Well, I want to follow up on what you were talking about, the double standard. I'm tempted to rephrase that as hypocrisy. And returning to this famous Paris, and I put in quotation marks, agreement, you may know that this differentiation that we just heard about wasn't incorporated in that until at the final hour, when there were two types of obligations, that is, should for the developing countries, and shall for the developing countries. It was determined that there had been a typo, so they both became should. So they can't even be purely hypocritical. Secondly, just last week, Australia opened up allowed the opening up of a new coal mine. Can they come to us, I mean us meaning in India, and say, don't do that? No. It's just not possible. But I would just say that... there you are. But I'm not expecting, as I said, I'm despairing about governments, because governments, as you whispered to me, you said before, they're responding to a certain part of their electorate, not necessarily the most enlightened part. But when they have a legal obligation, or told there's a legal obligation emanating from somewhere, it gives those well-meaning policymakers ammunition to speak against the naysayers. And it will not be direct. These advisory opinions, by their nature, are advisory. States do not have to comply with them directly. It has to go through some other channel. And I'm saying there's an example now coming to the fore in 2 weeks now in Sweden, in which there's a class action for the first time. If this were preceded by the advisory opinion, I'm sure that case would be more likely to lead to change of government policy.
Great. No, that's fantastic. I mean, just to build a bit on what Shyam was saying and challenge as well. So, you referred to the example of Europe after the Ukraine crisis. starting up their old, getting the cobwebs away and polishing up the coal mines and getting the coal factories and getting going. But my understanding, and I might be wrong, was that that was just a short-term measure for a couple of years, whilst one finds alternatives to the Russian gas that isn't there. And my understanding is there's a lot of investment now in renewables. So the Ukraine crisis has actually prompted a medium to long-term good future with short-term consequences. So it's not quite the same. But the Australian example is terrible. And I was going to cite another example, which is the Adani group in India. I mean, they obviously have plenty of resources. In the third richest man in the world at one point before the Hindenburg research came out, hundreds of billions of dollars of market capitalization, and still opening up new coal mines. I know he's also investing in renewables as well, but did he have to invest in a coal mine, and does it really make sense for a well-capitalized company to make an investment that we know has a 20 to 30-year horizon, given all the discussion? So I think there's a bit more India could do. I accept the resource story. India is obviously a poorer country, although it's soon going to be the third biggest economy in the world. But I accept that per capita it's a poorer country, and there isn't enough money to go around. And but when you have large quoted public companies like that, that should be stopped. And if they've got the capital, they should be making the right investments. I like your point about the states. The states need to make changes, to bring it down, because clearly governments can't always make decisions. We've seen, long-lasting, because of the opposition. You have this. Look at the U.S. This Tea Party politics. So change in the U.S. won't happen at a federal level. It's happening at the state level, and states can impact huge change. So you had. Bloomberg, when he was governor of New York, insisted that companies who sold commercial items in New York, had to clear up their rubbish. So Coca-Cola, at one point, was about to be banned from selling Coca-Cola in New York. So if you're a brand like Coca-Cola, you can't not sell in New York City. So that had an impact that completely changed the behavior of Coca-Cola as an organization in terms of their waste management, how they treat their water, how they sort of create their packaging, and how they manage their packaging and collect it. The electric car, the fact that the electric cars are becoming more and more a thing of the future, and not a thing of the present rather than a sort of far off vision of the future, is partly to do with Elon Musk, but more so to do with the government of California, because it was the government of California that mandated that any car by a certain period, I don't know whether it was 2020, 22, whatever, any car company selling in California had to have a certain percentage of their cars electric. So that meant that all the big car chains started investing in R&D there. And of course, they funded Elon Musk and gave him lots of subsidies, and so that he could build the Tesla factory. So that was perfect examples of where states, at the state level, or even at city level, at a mayor level, so not governor, mayor of New York, we made changes. So I think you're right, and of course this legal issue thing will be much more relevant when the decision making is at that level. Good. Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Sure. Okay, so let me repeat again. All that you have mentioned are very worthwhile, trends which we are seeing, and it is certainly worthwhile for us to try and intensify each one of these positive trends. So it is not my argument that somehow this is insignificant or this is too marginal. Of course, it has to be done at each and every level. So whatever you are saying in terms of what is already being done and what probably will emerge in the future, certainly very welcome. However, if we are seeing, for example, you said, isn't it temporary, the switch to coal? Well, if developing countries say, ours too is temporary, because unless you make available resources for us to make that transition, how do we do that? We don't have that luxury. So the question of, I can make a temporary sort of shift because I can, you know. What you did not say was that this is in trying to replace natural gas. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. Oil is a fossil fuel. They also create carbon emissions. So somehow to try and suggest that by using natural gas, I'm somehow renewable.
No, I think they're looking at other solutions rather than natural gas.
But everybody
Europe,
is looking for solutions. We are looking at solution, for example, green hydrogen.
Yeah.
So it's not that people are not looking for solutions. I'm just trying to make the point that the arguments that are being given in terms of this stepping back from what was supposed to be very, very ambitious kind of targets, this is not something that you are willing to give space to developing countries for. So, should the India not be doing more? Of course, India should be doing more. It is again not my argument that India should not do more, because I am convinced that if we continue with this fossil fuel-based growth, then India will face a dead end.
Right.
So we have to, in fact, adopt a strategy.
Because it'll affect a majority of the people of India,
Absolutely.
global warming, much more
Absolutely.
than, as I mentioned,
so
the 500 million
it
people.
makes sense for us, it makes bigger sense for us to actually lead that change. So that's not an issue.
But yeah, the thing is, you said, we need funding as a poor country, we need funding, we need resources and so on. I accept that, but funding can come in different forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be international forums like the IMF and the World Bank giving loans.
Private capital.
It can also be private capital, and it did.
Sure.
I mean, private foreign investors were the
yes.
biggest investors in Adani's companies.
Sure.
And so why was he incentivized to start?
He's not being incentivized.
Incentivized.
He follows his own, logic in terms
But
of.
he's doing that because the policymakers haven't created sufficient incentives to deter him, either through extra taxes on fossil fuels or feed-in tariffs or greater feed-in tariffs. I don't know if India has feed-in tariffs. Does India have feed-in tariffs for
Yes, we do.
renewables?
We do.
But is it largely subsidized? Could it be more subsidized?
Let me just set the record straight.
Yeah.
In India, even though we don't have a carbon tax,
Yeah.
today we have a cess on coal of 400 rupees per ton. So if you take into account India's current income levels and its per capita income level, actually this is a very, very ambitious measure, policy measure taken by the government.
What is it?
400 rupees per ton of coal produced.
And what percentage of the cost of that is a
Well,
percentage
it
of
is
what do you buy
it
a
is
ton
doing
of coal
is
for?
what it is doing is
Yeah.
that this particular cess
Right.
is funding, or originally was
Yeah.
supposed to fund, a clean energy initiative. What has happened is that it is not just doing clean energy incentivization, but it is also going, because of budgetary pressures, it is also going and doing other things. But that is a very major commitment by India.
That's $5.7. Is that right on the current exchange rate?
Well, I'm not very sure.
Yeah, it's
but
about
it
17
would be
rupees,
about $5.
How much does a
less
ton
than,
of coal
less
cost?
than $5.
What's the percentage that it is of the cost of the coal?
Well, probably
it's clearly not a good enough
probably
incentive.
not
otherwise-
a huge
that's
huge
the problem.
amount.
Yeah.
But
Should
coal
be
in
more.
India
Yeah.
is the cheapest fuel available.
That's the problem, exactly.
No,
So
no,
the
no,
tax should be greater.
we have to take that into account. As I said, you cannot expect India or any other country to compromise on its developmental prospects, even if it is the short run, by taking on greater, responsibilities than others who are much more capable than India, much more, capital rich than India, and they do not. So if you are talking about private capital, and I completely agree that, funding is today available not just from, government sources, it is available to you from private sources as well. But ultimately, private sources are looking at what is going to be the return, right? Now, in terms of the return that they are looking for, what we hear today is, well, if you improved your investment regime, more money will come in. If you are better at IPR protection, then more money will come in. So again, the burden is put on you. That you are not getting capital, you are not getting investment because something is wrong with you. This is something which is a mug's game, frankly
Right,
speaking.
yeah.
So I think what we have to recognize is, I come back to my original point.
Yeah.
The problem is that all the actors we are talking about do not have a unified, coherent view of actually the planetary emergency that we are facing.
Yeah.
All these things that we are talking about, these are, policy measure here, policy measure there. It does not address what is the fundamental challenge, which is that the whole planet is at risk. And if the whole planet is at risk, then there's business of, a profit, rate here and a profit rate there. This is irrelevant. So that sense of being here in this challenge together, and that sense of solidarity that you need, a sense of togetherness that you need, because this is the only planet for us, only home for us.
Yes, but how do you change people's behavior? You
By
change through all these...
making them aware of this. By making them aware. You see, it is still the notion that somebody else is going to pay a bigger price than we do. So let them pay a bigger price. I'm not going to have to pay so much price.
Are you still
Everybody
Let
will
me-
pay.
let me,
Okay, go ahead.
I want to...
finish, and we'll finish that. Okay.
I want to follow up on what you said before. People who used to write books about how to get to yes, all these negotiating things. I'm thinking of writing a book, how to get to meh, or how to get to maybe. And that was characterized the type of debate we've had because of the differing views. It ends up at the lowest, even below the lowest common denominator. But I want to follow up on what you said about the International Criminal Court. That was an absolute miracle, despite all the countries, including very important countries, actively working against it. We ended up with the Rome Statute. It's actually functioning very, very well. And that's why I can be hopeful for this type of an effort that I'm making. We can achieve something if the right people are able to have ammunition to apply.
Great, sorry. I was not meant to be the moderator, so no one briefed me. What is that sign?
10 minutes left.
Oh, 10 minutes left. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, good. All right, so we have 10 minutes. Do you want speakers on the floor? Yeah, it's just... go ahead. Whilst we're getting a mic there.
Is it on? Yeah. So I find it a little confusing that part of the argument that we are making for planetary protection now is our accountability to future generations, shepherding the earth for the future. So how can we not have the past also be part of this argument? So to me, it seems like there has to be some kind of reparations model, for the West that industrialized extremely irresponsibly, not just sort of technologically speaking, but the backdrop of colonialism is not something we can ignore, right? So there's a lot of transfer of capital that went from countries whose ability has now been compromised as a result so that's not inconsequential. So how do we factor that into the conversation? So either, we can't say that we have obligations towards future generations without then saying that you can't simultaneously say that and say that the past is irrelevant. So I think the issue is, how do we combine those two? I understand, just listening to all of you, that how much responsibility who bears for the situation has to do with the current capacity, who can now actually do something in terms of monetary ways to develop technologies and move us towards a greener future. So I'm just curious to hear from all of you about how can we make a case for our future generations and our stewardship of this planet for the future without actually worrying about the past?
The past has happened, and I think we need to move on. We have 3 South Africans on the front row there. A perfect example of leadership in terms of Nelson Mandela when he came to power. trying to forget the past and move on in the future. And I think we'll never have that future if we dwell in the past. But I don't know if you have any thoughts. And Shyam. Sorry? Then we're getting bogged in. Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't agree with that. I think you cannot move on without being aware of what happened in the past. Now, in terms of what the question that you raised, what happened in Paris, which was not noticed, was that the concept of historical responsibility, which was an integral part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that was dropped. So, meaning thereby that let's forget the past, the race starts from now. This is the starting point. Naturally, if this is the starting point, then countries which are latecomers to development, their emissions will rise. Those who have already reached a certain level of development, their plateauing is coming down. Now, is that just? I would say, no, it is not just. But that was forced through at Paris. Secondly, we have, with great difficulty, at the last COP, managed to get a provision on loss and damage, compensation for loss and damage. Now, the principle has been accepted, which is a very important step forward, but you know, the devil will lie in the detail. Because that how it is going to be implemented is going to be still negotiated. So what is happening is that, yes, there are many positive trends which we are seeing. We are seeing a greater level of awareness than we have seen before. But the challenge is that that slow-moving trajectory is not aligned with the rate at which the planet is being threatened by climate change. So climate change is actually taking place at a much faster pace than before. You just look at the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate. This is a consensus opinion of scientists from across the world. If you look at that, you can see that the time for bringing about any kind of a positive change is running out. It's running out. So there is only a very short period of time window which is available to us to try and prevent further damage. I am afraid all the things that we are talking about are extremely positive and should be pursued and pursued very, very vigorously. But we have to be mindful of the fact that the rate at which this danger is actually galloping, you know, whatever we are doing is simply not good enough. Thank you.
May I ask a question, please? Ambassador Saran. Ambassador Saran, yes, we have to recognize the past and we can't let go of that. And I quite agree with you that we can't possibly move on. Okay, I'll stand up.
Yeah.
And but the point is, look at the present. I mean, in this country, we've witnessed what's happening in Vizhinjam, which is Kerala, and you know the Adani port, and the people came out. They had reports about how this is going to really impact the marine life and also the lives of several thousands who live in coastal Kerala. A couple of years ago in Thoothukudi, we saw one Sterlite, company being shut where 13 people lost their lives. There is awareness, but ultimately everything gets mired in politics because elections have to be won. All these political parties, both in Tamil Nadu as well as Kerala, in their manifestos had, they had made a commitment about saving the environment. But ultimately, you go out, you protest, and these protests went on for years and months. But today, all of us have moved past. So what do? There is awareness. Sonu spoke about how there has to be motivation, there has to be social responsibility. There is enough and more of that. But it happens, then elections happen, and we actually move on. What's the way forward?
So there are two things here. One is that while I also said earlier in my remarks that there has been a greater awareness of the kind of dangers and the threats that we are facing as a result of climate change, I mentioned to you how across India, in some of the remotest rural areas, there is actually very, very interesting work going on in order to adapt to climate change which is taking place and also to try and deal with some of the other challenges. But it has not reached a point in India where it is an important item on the political agenda. So you look at the recent, elections, for example, in Karnataka. Did we have any mention of climate change? Anything about the environment? No. So this is depressing because the challenge is, as you say, how serious it is, and yet the kind of public awareness and mobilization so that the politician does not have an alternative to taking note of that public concern and responding to it. We have unfortunately not reached that stage. That is the problem. So you have to do a great deal of work to make this now on top of the agenda, political agenda. Only then things will actually start moving.
And there have been examples where you do have enlightened government, like Germany. So Germany were quite enlightened on their whole view on solar, and so there was it was a big debate because the concern was that taxpayers' money was being squandered. And they created a very high feed-in tariff, which, of course, resulted in losses in the short term. But what it created is the second or third largest solar industry in the world. So the actual taxpayers eventually benefited from that. So I think one needs enlightened government. And on that subject, does India have any strategic initiatives to, like we know that China wanted to dominate the solar renewables and battery technology. So they're really... strategically, the government are focusing, supporting, subsidizing, encouraging, and penalizing those who aren't focused on some of these strategic sectors. So are there any sustainability-related sectors and green future sectors that the Indian government is doing similar things to, just as the US are also with their what do they call it, the Anti-Inflation Act? What do they call it? The Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA, yeah.
So India has, the National Solar Mission is precisely what you're saying, that we have recognized that for India, which is a tropical country, the sun is a very, very significant source of power. And India's future, energy future, will have solar energy as one of its significant components. No doubt about that. How do you go about it? Now, in the short term, it actually, because you do not currently have a solar energy manufacturing sector in India, you have to essentially depend upon imports. And the main imports are coming from China, which is the cheapest source. But our view is that India offers a scale comparable to China. Therefore, that scale enables us to think in terms of a solar manufacturing industry which can be quite competitive.
And is India doing that? Because that was actually my
Absolutely.
question is, like China's strategy is to dominate the world of solar.
Well, I don't think we are looking to dominate the world, but we certainly believe that our scale offers the potential for much more competitive manufacture than perhaps in other countries.
And so what are the policymakers doing in terms of creating policies to encourage that?
Yeah, you are incentivizing, the solar energy manufacturing sector by giving, various kinds of incentives. You have the PLI, for example, the production-linked incentive system. What you are also doing is that in terms of, the renewable power obligation on various industries under our Energy Conservation Act, that encourages the use of renewable energy. You have something like a carbon trading system, but in India it is called the perform and trade, arrangement, which is benchmarks are set for all very heavy energy intensive industry, that for every, say $1 of output, this is the benchmark, efficiency benchmark which we will use. So those who are below the benchmark have to avoid penalty by buying credit from those who are performing better.
Right.
So there is a market in that like a trading. Now, we have also accepted that perhaps India has reached a stage where it can even go in for a carbon market.
Right.
So currently we are looking at the possibility of how we can set up a nationwide, market for carbon. That too will encourage this. But what is very important is that today we have a solar manufacturing industry which is in its infancy, but it is expanding very fast because the demand is expanding very fast.
I just want, I know
Actually, we should perhaps finish because I see the sommelier with
I just want to
4
say
bottles
one-
of wine. So we'll finish off with you,
I don't
Gudmundur.
want to be necessarily the last, but I do want to have a post-session caveat.
But there she is, yeah. We'll have them at lunch, yeah. Okay.
I want to have a post-session caveat that recalling what my Vice Chancellor, C. Raj Kumar, said when I was launching this kind of a thought. He said, isn't it funny that lawyers think that they can solve the problems and no one else can? And same thing with economists and same thing and so forth. So I don't feel that what I'm suggesting is going to solve all the problems. You've heard a lot of other things from other people, and
Yeah.
good luck to all of us. Thank you.
But I think it's a combination of everything, isn't it? So thank you.